Deep within the archives of Yale University, amidst yellowed documents and forgotten manuscripts, an extraordinary discovery came to light in the winter of 2023, a sealed envelope, marked only with the initials AE, and the date March 15, 1955, just a month before Albert Einstein's death, contained a magnetic tape recording and handwritten notes that would reveal the most intimate and spiritual side of the greatest scientific genius of the 20th century. The recording, originally in German with a simultaneous English translation, featured Einstein's unmistakable voice, but not speaking about relativity, quantum physics, or cosmology. His words, laden with a rarely seen vulnerability, explored territories he had never dared to discuss publicly: the nature of the soul, communication with the deceased, and the mysteries that exist beyond common human perception. The historical context of this secret confession goes back to the physicist's final years, when he no longer worried about his academic reputation or social conventions. At 76, Einstein had witnessed the two world wars, the creation of the atomic bomb, partly a result of his theoretical discoveries, and the deaths of loved ones who profoundly shaped his perspective on existence. His wife Elsa had passed away in 1936, followed by his sister Maja in 1951. These consecutive bereavements opened wounds in his soul that science could not heal. According to the notes found with the recording, Einstein began to seriously question the limits of physical reality after an experience he described as the moment the boundary between the visible and the invisible dissolved before my eyes. It was an autumn night in 1953, and the physicist was working alone in his study when he felt a familiar presence. It wasn't a hallucination or the product of fatigue. It was something that defied his entire rational understanding of the world. Einstein's recorded voice begins with a hesitation that never characterized his scientific presentations. He talks about how, for decades, he built his career on solid mathematical foundations and empirical evidence, but that in his final years he began to realize that the universe held secrets that transcended any equation. His first great spiritual revelation occurred while he was organizing some old letters from Maja, his deceased sister. While reading a particularly emotional correspondence, he felt a warm presence envelop him like an invisible embrace. Einstein describes on the recording how he initially tried to rationalize the experience, attributing it to fatigue or nostalgia. However, similar phenomena began to repeat with increasing frequency. Objects that belonged to deceased loved ones seemed to pulse with a subtle energy. Old photographs emanated a sense of life that defied any conventional scientific explanation. The physicist who revolutionized our understanding of space-time began to suspect that death was not the absolute end he had always imagined. The first concrete indication that the deceased could in some way remain conscious and capable of communication came through an extraordinarily vivid dream. Einstein dreamt of his deceased friend Michele Besso, with whom he had shared countless discussions about physics and philosophy. In the dream, Besso appeared exactly as Einstein remembered him, but there was a different light in his eyes, a wisdom that transcended any earthly knowledge. Besso spoke about the continuity of consciousness beyond physical death, using metaphors that connected physical concepts with spiritual realities. When Einstein awoke, he found notes in his own handwriting about concepts he didn't remember writing. The equations seemed familiar, but described phenomena he had never formally studied: relationships between consciousness and energy, interdimensional links between connected souls, and formulas that suggested the possibility of communication beyond traditional physical limits. Initially, Einstein attributed everything to the subconscious working on unresolved problems, but the precision and sophistication of the notes left him deeply intrigued. In the following months, Einstein began experimenting with a practice he called focused conscious contemplation. Every night after finishing his scientific work, he sat silently in his favorite armchair and directed his thoughts to loved ones who had passed away. It wasn't prayer in the traditional sense. Einstein always maintained a complex relationship with conventional religious concepts, but rather a form of focused mental communication, similar to the concentration he applied to solving complex mathematical problems. The first few weeks yielded no perceptible results, but Einstein persisted with the discipline of a true scientist exploring unknown territory. Gradually, he began to notice subtle shifts in his perception during these moments of contemplation, feelings of inexplicable warmth, fragrances associated with specific deceased individuals, and a growing sense that his thoughts were being heard by invisible presences. The most significant discovery came when Einstein decided to mentally converse with his father Hermann Einstein, who had passed away in 1902. During one of these sessions of focused contemplation, Einstein began to mentally recount his scientific successes, his personal regrets, and his hopes for the future of humanity. To his surprise, he began to receive what he could only describe as answers, not in audible words, but in sudden insights, intuitive understandings, and feelings of approval or concern that seemed to come from a source external to his own mind. Einstein describes in the recording how these experiences initially left him deeply uncomfortable. His entire career had been built on rigorous scientific skepticism, empirical verification, and distrust of claims that could not be mathematically demonstrated. However, the experiences were too consistent to be easily dismissed as imagination or wishful thinking. He decided to apply the same scientific rigor he used in his physical research to investigate these spiritual phenomena. Einstein began to keep a detailed diary of his experiences communicating with the deceased, documenting patterns, frequencies, environmental conditions, and emotional states that seemed to facilitate or inhibit these connections. He discovered that periods of intense emotional stress or scientific concern tended to block these communications, while moments of serenity, gratitude, and genuine love seemed to open clearer channels. One of the most surprising discoveries was that communication didn't depend on physical proximity to objects or places associated with the deceased. Einstein could establish equally clear connections with his sister Maja, whether he was in Princeton, at his summer home, or traveling. This led him to theorize that spiritual communication operated through dimensions that transcended the spatial limitations described by conventional physics. The recording reveals how Einstein gradually developed what he called a spiritual communication protocol, a systematic methodology for establishing contact with discarnate consciousnesses. The process involved three distinct stages. First, a period of mental centering, where he emptied his mind of everyday concerns. Second, a phase of loving invocation where he directed genuine feelings of affection and respect towards the deceased person. And third, a period of receptive listening, where he remained open to receiving impressions, insights, or sensations that might constitute answers. During these experiments, Einstein discovered that different deceased individuals seemed to have distinct communication styles. His sister Maja tended to communicate through warm emotions and feelings of comfort, while his friend Mikhail Bissot seemed to prefer conveying complex ideas through sudden insights or scientific inspirations. His father, Hermann, communicated primarily through what Einstein described as a stabilizing presence, a feeling of paternal support and approval that left him with feelings of peace and direction. A particularly striking experience occurred when Einstein attempted to communicate with Max Planck, the German physicist who had passed away in 1947 and who was considered the father of quantum theory. During one of these sessions, Einstein reported receiving insights into interpretations of quantum mechanics that he had never considered before. The ideas were too sophisticated to be a product of his conscious imagination, yet they organically connected with his existing physical knowledge in ways that suggested an external source of information. It was at this point in his spiritual discovery that Einstein began to fundamentally question his own resistance to the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics. His famous statement, "God does not play dice with the universe," had been motivated by his belief in universal determinism and his reluctance to accept fundamentally random elements in nature. However, his experiences of spiritual communication suggested the existence of levels of reality where traditional causality might not apply in the same way. For those following these extraordinary revelations about the most intimate and spiritual aspects of one of history's greatest minds, it's worth remembering that discoveries like this, lost documents, secret confessions, and hidden manuscripts of great thinkers, continue to emerge regularly. Subscribing to this channel ensures you're notified immediately whenever new accounts of this kind come to light, providing exclusive access to historical secrets that redefine our understanding of the nature of human consciousness and the mysteries that exist beyond common perception. Einstein describes in the recording how these experiences gradually modified his perspective on the nature of consciousness and its relationship to the physical brain. He began to suspect that consciousness wasn't merely a product of neural activity, but rather a form of energy that could exist independently of the material substrate. This personal theory was radically different from the scientific materialism that dominated his era and which he himself had accepted for most of his career. The most dramatic confirmation of his theories on spiritual communication came through an experience Einstein described as the moment the veil between worlds completely lifted. It was March 1955, just a few weeks before his death, and Einstein was working in his study when he felt a familiar and powerful presence. This time, it wasn't a subtle sensation or a vague impression. It was an almost tangible presence that he immediately recognized as his deceased wife, Elsa. Einstein describes how Elsa seemed to be standing beside his desk, not exactly visible in the conventional sense, but undeniably present. She radiated a soft light that cast no shadows, and seemed to communicate directly with his mind without using spoken words. The message she conveyed was both a warning and a comfort. Einstein was approaching his own transition to what she called the next stage of conscious existence. During this extraordinary experience, Elsa showed Einstein what he described as visions of the process of death and rebirth of consciousness. He saw how physical death was merely a transition, similar to the metamorphosis of a caterpillar into a butterfly, not a destruction, but a fundamental transformation. Individual consciousness, instead of being extinguished, was liberated from physical limitations and expanded to levels of perception and understanding unimaginable during earthly life. Einstein recounts that during this vision, he understood that all the people he had loved and lost continued to exist in a state of expanded consciousness, and that they had been trying to communicate with him throughout his life. He simply hadn't been sensitive enough to perceive these attempts at contact. The most moving discovery was that every loving word directed towards the deceased, every caring thought, every moment of genuine longing, had been heard and appreciated by these discarnate consciousnesses. The revelation brought a profound understanding of the interconnected nature of all consciousnesses. Einstein realized that the separation between the living and the dead was largely an illusion created by the limitations of human physical perception. In reality, there was a continuity of consciousness that transcended death, and the loving bonds formed during physical life created permanent channels of communication that persisted indefinitely. Einstein describes how this understanding completely transformed his perspective on his own personal losses. The pain of physical separation remained real, but it now coexisted with a deep certainty that his connections with loved ones had never truly been interrupted. Elsa, Maja, his parents, his deceased friends, all continued to be a part of his life in ways he had finally learned to perceive and cherish. The recording reveals that Einstein spent his final days actively practicing spiritual communication and consciously preparing for his own transition. He no longer feared death, but viewed it as a graduation to a higher level of existence. His last handwritten notes, found alongside the recording, detail elaborate plans to attempt communication with living colleagues after his own death, using codes and signals only they would recognize. During his final experiences of spiritual communication, Einstein reported making contact with historical figures he had never personally known in physical life. Galileo Galilei, Isaac Newton, and even Leonardo da Vinci seemed accessible through the same communication protocols he had developed for contacting people in his personal circle. These communications suggested that death provided access to a kind of universal library of consciousness, where all minds that had ever existed remained accessible. One of the most fascinating discoveries was that these great historical minds seemed to continue working in their fields of interest even after physical death. Newton continued exploring the fundamental laws of the universe, but now with an expanded perspective that included spiritual dimensions. Galileo persisted in his quest for scientific truth, but could now perceive connections between physics and metaphysics that had been inaccessible during his earthly life. Einstein began to theorize that death did not represent the end of intellectual curiosity or personal growth, but rather the beginning of a phase where these activities could be pursued without the limitations imposed by the physical brain and bodily needs. Learning continued, but at scales and speeds transcending anything possible during physical life. His final notes include sketches of equations he claimed to have received through communication with deceased physicists. These formulas described relationships between consciousness, energy, and information in ways that anticipated theoretical developments only explored by mainstream physics decades later. Einstein speculated that many scientific discoveries might actually result from unconscious communication with discarnate minds who continued researching and making discoveries at levels beyond physical perception. The final transformative experience occurred just days before Einstein's death. During a particularly profound session of spiritual communication, he reported being transported to what he described as a dimension where past, present, and future coexisted simultaneously. In this state of expanded consciousness, he could perceive his own life, from birth to imminent death, as a single coherent event within a much larger pattern of existence. Einstein described seeing how every person he had loved, every scientific discovery he had made, every moment of joy and sorrow, had contributed to a cosmic tapestry of experience and growth that extended far beyond his individual life. His perspective expanded to include not only his own journey, but the interconnected journeys of all conscious beings who had existed or would exist. During this transcendental vision, Einstein understood that the question of whether the deceased hear us when we speak to them had a far more complex and beautiful answer than he had ever imagined. Not only do the deceased hear us, they remain actively involved in our lives, offering subtle guidance, inspiration, and unconditional love. Communication flows constantly in both directions, limited only by our ability to perceive and interpret these subtle exchanges. The deepest discovery was that true love creates lasting bonds that transcend any physical or temporal limitations. Every genuine expression of affection directed toward someone who has passed strengthens these bonds and facilitates clearer communication. The deceased don't just hear us, they respond constantly, through synchronicities, sudden insights, meaningful dreams, and that inexplicable feeling of presence we sometimes sense in moments of emotional need. Einstein concluded that physical death is merely a transition to a state of existence where loving communication not only continues, but becomes purer and more direct. The limitations of spoken language, sensory perception, and even linear time are removed, allowing for forms of connection that transcend anything possible during physical life. His final words on the recording constitute a message of hope and guidance for all those grappling with personal loss. Einstein asserts that we never truly lose those we love, they simply move to a different dimension of existence, but remain as real and accessible as they ever were. The key to maintaining these connections is to cultivate genuine love, remain open to perceiving subtle signs, and trust that communication continues even when we cannot consciously perceive it. The recording ends with Einstein expressing profound gratitude for having discovered these truths during his final years of life. He describes how this knowledge transformed his perspective on death from a source of fear to a source of anticipation. Death did not represent the end of his conscious existence, but rather the beginning of a much grander adventure where he would reunite with all those he had loved and continue exploring the mysteries of the universe with infinitely more powerful tools of perception. Einstein died on April 18, 1955, less than a month after making this extraordinary recording. According to the instructions left in his notes, the recording was to remain sealed until humanity was ready to understand that science and spirituality are complementary aspects of a single greater reality. The fact that this recording has finally come to light suggests that this moment may have arrived. The implications of this discovery are profound and far-reaching. If Einstein's experiences are true, they suggest that death is not the absolute end that our materialistic culture assumes it to be. Instead, it represents a graduation to a higher level of conscious existence, where learning, growth, and especially love continue in ways that transcend our current imaginations. For those who carry the pain of loss, Einstein's revelations offer extraordinary solace and hope. Every whispered word to a departed loved one, every loving thought directed toward them, every moment spent recalling shared memories, all of this is received, cherished, and responded to by consciousness that continue to live and love in dimensions beyond ordinary physical perception. This discovery also suggests that our current scientific understanding of the nature of consciousness is drastically incomplete. If Einstein's experiences are valid, then consciousness operates through principles that transcend known physical laws, and our survival after physical death may be not only possible but inevitable. Perhaps the most comforting aspect of Einstein's revelations is his insistence that true love creates enduring connections that no force in the universe can break. Death may change how we communicate with those we love, but it can never eliminate these fundamental bonds. In a universe where love is the most powerful and enduring force, we are never truly separated from those we hold in our hearts. This lost recording of Albert Einstein reminds us that even the greatest scientific minds can be transformed by the discovery that the universe is far more mysterious, interconnected, and fundamentally loving than our current theories suggest. The boundary between science and spirituality may be far more tenuous than we imagine, and the deepest truths about existence may reside not only in mathematical equations, but also in the wisdom of the human heart, when it opens itself to perceive realities that transcend the limits of ordinary physical perception.